Bajito la cámara.
Más que ¿Hablamos después del curso entonces? ¿Después de la sesión?
¿Sí?
Sí, llego a tu oficina.
Allá viene, sí, ahí en la oficina.
Ok.
Bueno, yo creo que ya llegaría también.
Perfecto.
¿Cómo está todo por ahí?
Perfecto.
¿No? ¿No descargaste masiva?
No,
¿Se gustan? Vamos a comenzar.
Solo los años que me interesaban.
Video.
Solo los años que me interesaban. Pero se puede todo el noche.
Let Professor Drew, if you want, we can start. It's not working. No. Okay. Good. Okay. Welcome again, everybody. There's less here today than last Monday. I hope it's for another reason than the quality of the presentation on Monday. We have more people connected by streaming. Okay. So today we're going to look at input output at a global level. And this is a set of books, three books, together more than 1,600 pages that we collected together with Heinz Kurz and Christian Lager, and they are both at the University of Graz. So these books are not famous, but they are in a famous series of books. It's actually the International Library of Critical Writings in Economics, and this is version 92. They are published by Edward Elgar. These books, don't try to buy them because they are incredibly expensive. I think 3 volumes, 1 volume costs 500 euros. So that would be 10,000 pesos, only one. And these books actually are made by Edward Elgar. And now this is number 92, and that was in 1998 it was published. Now they are issues number 300, whatever. So every specific topic in economics is covered by a set of these books. And Edward Elgar started this library of critical writings a long time ago. And the idea was that a lot of libraries in Japan they were destroyed in the Second World War. So all the books in Japan had been at universities had been gone. And therefore, and also in developing economies, there were no libraries or universities were starting to build up the libraries. And Edward Alger thought, okay, it would be interesting for such new or in Japan destroyed libraries where they have to start again, to have on each and every topic, to have the best papers collected. And this was the days when internet even wasn't there. We were emailing, and that was about it. So Edward Alger asks people who they think are renowned in the field to collect a set of papers of which the editors think everybody must be able to read these papers. And that is what Edward Alger makes a lot of money on. I mean, I told you what the prices of the books. I can also tell you what we earned on these books. We got £250. In those days, that would be something like $400 US. And we had to share the $400 amongst the three of us. So we got almost nothing. All the money went to Edward Alger. And you would think, okay, kill Edward Alger or destroy whatever, but he uses, the company uses the money to finance the publishing of books that otherwise would not have been published. There's also, well, you need some copies to sell, and books of which beforehand, you know, maybe you sell 100, but not more than that. Edward Alger says, okay, we can publish them because we earned a lot of money on these books. So okay, there is a price to pay, but at least the company does something decent with it. So that was 1998. In 2022, the paper got a little bit thinner because now we have more than 1,800 pages in just 2 volumes. And the price was still very high. And I did this together with Michael Lahr and from Rutgers University in the US, and Manfred Lenssen, he's at the University of Sydney. He's at the School of Fit. And both are good colleagues, both are very well known also in input-output. Both have been editor of economic systems research, as I did a long time ago. So the same structure, we have included only papers after 1998. And so the question is, when looking back, the question is, what has changed since 1998? That was the question. And that is the question that I'm going to answer today. I'll tell you what, in my view, has changed in these 22, 23 years. So the outline is, I will start with an introduction. This was not the introduction yet. And then I will point out the 2 turning points in history. And I think what has been crucial for, at least for input-output, was the Kyoto Protocol and the working with the Kyoto Protocol and how countries dealt with the Kyoto Protocol and international fragmentation. And these 2 issues, these 2 turning points call for developing world input-output tables. And if we take then into account the global value chains that you can calculate with world input-output tables, then in the second part of the presentation, I will talk about greenhouse gas calculations and footprints, and I will talk about value added and results for value added. and also for employment. Can I click here or?
Yes, I'm doing the access, but
Okay.
it disappear when they come where when they enter to the class.
Oh, okay.
It disappear.
Good. So what you will hear today is nothing new. And we say old wine in new bottles. So all that I'm going to talk about today was already known. In so-called inter-regional input-output tables. And these were input-output tables for one country, split into provinces or north, south, east, west, or counties, or whatever. So the mathematics and the methodology was already known. So we're talking about standard methods that are now applied to new questions, new problems. This, of course, you know. You will see that I've stolen a few slides from my presentation on Monday afternoon. Was everybody in the room present on Monday afternoon? No, some were not. Okay.
I think you are not.
No. Okay, I will still tell you what this is. Well, all the others can tell you that this is a black-headed spider monkey. And a black-headed spider monkey is a threatened species. And why is it a threatened species? Because this one lives in Colombia, and in Colombia, their natural habitat is destroyed. Why is the natural habitat destroyed? Because of me loving my cup of coffee. If I want Colombian coffee beans, me in Europe, consumers anywhere over the world, they ask for Colombian coffee beans, which means that there have to come more coffee plantations in Colombia, and therefore the natural habitat of this black-headed spider monkey is destroyed. So the point here is that, for example, me, an EU consumer, I threaten the existence of black-headed spider monkeys in Colombia. Does this mean that I stop drinking coffee? No. Is that the intention of the story, that we should stop drinking coffee? No. But we should be aware of what is going on. And perhaps, we can do something. Not necessarily stop drinking coffee. So, typical thing that is happening nowadays is that local threats are driven by consumers across the world. And so it's the local producers in Colombia, for example, the farmers, directly degrade and destroy the habitat. But it's consumers and also consumers abroad, me sitting in Europe, with my coffee, that benefit from and actually call for degradation and destruction. So the question, who is responsible? Who is more responsible? So the question is, well, two questions actually. Who pulls the trigger? Who increases the coffee plantation and kills or destroys the natural habitat? And the other question is for whom? And this is, of course, the typical American family with 3 kids. This story actually about the black-headed spider monkeys, this is an example of a piece of research that Manfred Lenzen and his group did using world input-output tables. they made their own world input output tables, and they are huge. And they have, I think in those days, they had 198 input output countries. And they did a lot of, used a lot of additional information. For example, they used the information, which species are threatened, and how come that species are threatened. So, for example, one example of threatening a species is basically killing the animal, shooting the animal, or fishing, or in this case, destroying the habitat. And they had several causes, something like 50 causes of potential threatening. And they calculated, they linked this information to each other. So in the end, they were able, and they linked it to industries. So for example, in industry education, where I am, there is not much threatening. But in the industry of agriculture, forestry, and fishing, there probably is quite a bit of threatening activities going on. So what they did is that for all these 198 countries, they linked the information to the industry level, how much of the species and which species were threatened. So they could calculate which species were threatened, how much for example, in Malaysia, and how many species were threatened in Malaysia due to German consumption, for example. So that is what they did, and I will come back to this example a little bit later, I think. So the typical issue in the last 20 years is that actions here today have consequences tomorrow somewhere else on the other side of the world. And this is the case more than ever before. So the point was that analyzing policy issues needs a good quantification, and that requires a metric. So that is a good system of measurement. And at the end of the 20th century, there were several policy issues related to employment, related to pollution, to emissions, that could not be handled adequately with the existing method and the existing tables. We had national input-output tables. The OECD in those days already had a collection of national input-output tables. They have been made more or less uniform. All the input-output tables in the data set by the OECD had 48 countries, and it was a nice data set, but they were all national input-output. So the idea was we need to adapt our metric and construct new data. So the metric, it turns out, has been developed. So nowadays that is called global value chain analysis and footprint analysis. I'll go through the details later. And the data are the global multi-regional input-output tables. So by the end of the century, 20th century, everybody was convinced that, hey, we need new data. We need to look further than we have done so far. So from a historical point of view, at least my point of view, is that there were two turning points. And one is the Kyoto Protocol, and the other one is the international fragmentation. The Kyoto Protocol stems from 1997. And in a nutshell, it's an agreement, was an agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the period 2008-2012 to approximately on average 95% of the 1990 levels. And the Kyoto Protocol was ratified by many countries. Some countries did not have to participate in the Kyoto Protocol. These were, in particular, the, let's say, poor countries. So this was an agreement that, well, that was ratified by many, let's say, rich countries, higher income countries. The idea was that they would be able to finance the consequences of reducing their emission levels. I'm talking here about on average, because the percentage differs per country. Some countries reduce 7%, some countries only 1 or 2%, but on average it's something like approximately 95%. The trick in this, or the very, very strong point in this Kyoto Protocol, is the 1990 level. Suppose that China had to ratify the Kyoto Protocol. We're talking about 2008, 2012. So at that time, China's emissions were not sky high, but they were halfway to what they are now. In 1990, the levels were, well, not zero, but very little. So if you have to reduce your emissions from approximately 4 gigatons in 2008, no, it was in 2008, it was more. It was something like 7 gigatons, down to, whoop, thank you. Reduced from 7 gigatons to 95% of 1 gigaton, that is huge. Well, China was a developing country, so they did not have to ratify, they were not even asked to ratify the Kyoto Protocol. But you see that the tricky thing is not in these numbers, the tricky thing is in the 1990 levels. That was the tricky thing. Now, you should be aware of the fact that these are so-called territorial emissions. So we're talking about the emissions in the US, in China, in Mexico. And also the Paris Agreement is also expressed in terms of territorial emissions. Well, territorial emissions in principle is very simple. You build a wall around the country and you see what comes out in terms of emissions. That is territorial emissions. And sometimes when I tell this story in China, they say, hey, what's new? We already have the wall. So the consequence of expressing the Kyoto Protocol or any policy measurement proposal in terms of territorial emissions is that some countries started to import dirty products from abroad instead of producing them at home. This is also the story that we had Monday on the pollution haven. I'm not going to do dirty production at home. You do it for me and I import from you. And in return, you get some clean products from me for a nice price. So what happens is that the dark clouds over the US and Europe, because the rich countries, they pollute a whole lot. Now, they buy, sorry, this is just an example. They buy cement, and cement, as I mentioned also Monday, is one of the dirtiest products in terms of production. Now, suppose that Europe and the US buy cement from China. What happens then the dark clouds over the US and Europe, these emissions in US and Europe will decrease, but the emissions in China will increase. So the dark clouds over the US and Europe, they move to China. That is what happens. However, the point is that CO2 emissions are global pollutants, greenhouse gas emissions in general. They are global pollutants. So it is what is blown into the air here today is spread out and is on the other side of the world more or less tomorrow. So that is what is the problem of these global pollutants. So the export of cement, and therefore also the CO2 emissions from China to the US, the question is, who is responsible for that? Because the cement is used to build new offices, new houses. So it's basically the Americans and the Europeans who ask for the cement. So in principle, it is the Europeans and European consumers and American government that ask for the cement. Why not hold them responsible? So the exports of cement are responsibility of the US. So this is the guy that we've seen before. Let's see. Was not better. Probably it's
I think we can.
so it's ready in. Manage. No problem. So the guy now today said in yellow, it's your responsibility. And actually this this led to a whole different viewpoint on CO2 emissions. So the emissions, the territorial emissions, part of the territorial emissions in the US, that is for driving a car, heating the house, etc. So that is the emissions by the residents themselves when they burn the fossil fuels. And a large part, as we saw on Monday, that is approximately 80–90%, in China a little bit more. The large part of the emissions in a country are in the production process. Now, what emissions can a country be held responsible for? The emissions for which, in this example, the US is responsible, is the emissions in the US, the territorial emissions, minus US export of emissions. Because that is the responsibility of the consumer somewhere else, plus the imports, US import of emissions. So this would include the Chinese emissions in the cement that is used by American households to build a new house, or the Dutch government building a new block of offices using Chinese cement. Well, in that case, it would be for the Dutch responsibility. Now, this is the definition of the carbon footprint. In this case, we're talking about CO2, so we're talking about the carbon footprint. It is defined as, well, let them join in. Okay, maybe they learned something. I don't know. So the definition is how much emissions are due to embodied in the US consumption. This would be US carbon footprint. Two other terms that are linked to this story. One is the territorial, one is production-based emissions, and the other one is consumption-based emissions accounting. It's a way of accounting the emissions. And this starts with, let's say, the producers look at the territorial emissions and look at where and exactly which industry, not really produces, but generates the emissions. So this is the story, who pulls the trigger and how much. And this is the story for whom. And that is, well, this is the American family that we saw before, who consume products, something is on their plate. And the question is, how much of emissions anywhere in the world, global emissions, are embodied in your consumption plate? That is the footprint. Footprint, who consumes the emissions and how much. So the key question in terms of the Kyoto Protocol is who emits how much for whom. And now we have the data and we can answer the question. So the second part of the turning point is was the international fragmentation. So we're living in a fragmented world, and in principle, the question who emits how much for whom is in principle easy to answer. You take the export of a country and you calculate how many emissions are embodied. You do this for every exporter, and you do this for every partner, and you have the answer. Now, in practice, this is more or less what we did before. But now it's no longer so easy, because exports of certain good goes back and forth and all over the world several times before it ends with the final consumer. So on Monday, in the keynote, I gave the example of a pair of jeans, and the average pair of jeans travels 65,000 kilometers. That is 3 times around the world before it ends with the final consumer. So before I can put on a pair of jeans, it has traveled a long way. So this is due to 2 waves of global unbundling. And the first wave of global unbundling was in the past, a long time ago. So in the old days, and then when I say old days, I mean a few hundred years ago. So a few hundred years ago, what we did is very simple. What we eat, we have to produce here. Basically, we were all farmers, so we were producing food, and what was produced here was eaten by ourselves. Now, the first wave of global unbundling is that the location of consumption, so the place where you eat, where the consumers are, is different from the place where the final good is produced. So all of a sudden, in the Netherlands, we could eat bananas. And I can tell you, maybe we are bananas and nuts, but we don't produce bananas. We don't have the climate. So that is the first wave of global unbundling. The second wave of global unbundling is here I eat, here I produce the final product. And in the past, that was 30, 40 years ago, what was produced, the final product, if it was produced here, I used the intermediate products from my neighbors, neighboring countries, or preferably within the country. Now, the second wave of unbundling is that I, as a final producer of a final good, get by my inputs where they are cheapest, and that is all over the world. That is the second wave of global unbundling. So the location of producing the final good is no longer the same as the location where the inputs are produced. This has become possible, in particular, thanks to our computers. Because with these computers, it's very easy, relatively easy, to run your logistics for operations on the other side of the world. In the past, if you want to buy inputs from another country, you had to take the airplane and go there and negotiate with people face to face. But nowadays, a lot of things can be done on a computer 24 hours a day. Plus, the travel costs have decreased tremendously. Now, this is international fragmentation. So the production process, that is one thing, is split up into ever smaller parts. We all want to make money, as much money as we can. So we all specialize in very little specific niches, specific details of the production process. And you see that also in countries specialize in certain parts. So it's not only fragmentation, but it's also that the specialization takes place in another country. So it is international fragmentation. So what we see is that there has been an enormous growth in trade and intermediate inputs. In the past, say up to the year 2000, the large part of trade was trade in final products. So that was trade in products that were used by consumers, households, and investors, etc. Nowadays, the bulk of the trade is in the intermediate inputs. And this means that we had to rewrite all the books on trade theory and international trade and international economics, because all the theories were based originally on trade in final goods, and now we have to check whether all these theories were still valid if we also include intermediate goods. And in some cases, the theories had to be adapted. So the idea is to answer the question, who emits how much for whom? We're going to use input-output analysis in connection with global multi-regional input-output tables. So if you check in the literature, we use very often world input-output tables. The abbreviation in the literature is very often GMRIO. Global multi-regional input-output. So those of you who were at the lecture on Monday, they can now take mentally a little break, because this is the story of what these input-output tables look like. But I will wake you up and I will tell you when I start talking about something new. For those of you, the viewers at home, hello. Perhaps, well, if you have been online on Monday, you can now go to the kitchen and prepare a cup of coffee. Those of you who were not online on Monday, keep watching. So we have here the world consists of 3 countries in this very simple example: just France, Germany, and the USA. Do it for any country you like. Of course, there's many more countries, but not many more would fit on this screen. Every country has the same number and actually the same industries. And here I have depicted 3: mining, steel manufacturing, and car manufacturing in France, mining, steel manufacturing, car manufacturing in Germany, and in the US. And we have also mining, steel manufacturing in the columns for France, Germany, and the US. This part here is the final demands. We have final demands in France, in Germany, and in the US. The final demands are split into 3 categories. We have H for household consumption, I for investments, That will be gross fixed capital formation, and G for government expenditures, government consumption and investments. So what is in the table? There are lots of numbers. So again, row I, in this case, row US mining, column German steel manufacturing is what goes from US mining into German steel manufacturing. So it says from US mining to German steel manufacturing. In the same fashion, here in the final advance, column German households, car manufacturing in France in the rows. So it means from French car manufacturing into German households. For example, this is the Citroën car or the Renault car that is bought by a German household. Exactly the same way as we had for the national input-output tables. This is all the inputs that are used. Here is the value added that is used, so labor and capital. Yeah, that's it, labor and capital. And that is what we call the production recipe of, in this case, French steel manufacturing. I like the word production recipe very much, because whenever you use the word production process, you get into trouble with real economists. They start asking nasty questions about production functions and these kind of things. So this is basically, I told you already on Monday, Leonchev was blamed for doing not real economics, but was doing engineering economics. What most people do not know is that Leonchev, before he came up with the input-output, had written already 50 papers in American Economic Review, in the Review of Economic Studies, very, very, very serious economics journals before he came up with input-output. And these were all on micro, in particular microeconomic theory, real theory. So even if Leonchev was an engineering economist, he knew everything about the real hardcore economics, and he chose this because he wanted to be. In some of his papers, he talks about his motivation to do whatever he did, and he wanted to be closer to the real world. And this is much more a reflection of what is going in the real world than a representative consumer or a representative producer. So Leonchev made that choice on purpose. But the production recipe, that is a word that an engineering economist would use. Typically, we have additional information, so-called satellite accounts, and I've here listed employment and CO2 emissions. The crucial requirement for your additional information. And on Monday, I used the number of coffee machines in an industry. The crucial requirement is that you have the information at the same industry level. Here is the overly simplified example, and the question that I'm going through is how much CO2 is involved in the German export of cars to the US households, and where do the emissions take place? So you start, the output starts at the end, and the end is tell me how much you want to consume, final demands. Then I can calculate the production, and I can calculate how much employment and emissions are involved. So the model is what we call demand-driven. It's a final demand for final outputs that drive the model. So you start at the end, and the end is the German exports of cars. by American households? That was the question. So it is in column US households, and they buy German cars. Now, if that happens, then the German car manufacturing industry needs to start, needs to be activated, and they need to produce. So the German car manufacturing is in this column, and you see, according to their production recipe, they need inputs. So, for example, well, first of all, the car manufacturing in Germany, because they start working, producing extra, there will be German workers and German emissions involved. Also, there will be some steel manufacturing, steel products involved as an input. And in this example, they buy it from France. So it means that the French steel manufacturing needs to produce more to produce these inputs. Now, if this French steel manufacturing needs to produce more, then some French workers will be involved, some French emissions will be involved, and the French steel manufacturing requires inputs. For example, iron ores from the mining industry in the US, in this example. Again, in that case, the US mining industry starts working. It needs a lot of inputs, but also there will be some US workers and some US emissions involved. Of course, I would continue this with picking out here also more inputs. So this is a process that is indefinite. So in this simple example, German car exports of cars to the US consumers, there are some German, French, and US workers and emissions involved. So you could say that partly US consumers who buy these cars from Germany are responsible for the emissions in Germany, in France, and in the US. Of course, in the real world, much more complex, and there are many, many more errors due to the increase of fragmentation. Now, before we go on, for the break, I think, what is not on the slide, but what I can tell you is a bit of grandpa looking back to his younger years, when we all started working on these world input-output tables. So it was the end of the century, around 2000, and it was in the air. Everybody knew that we can make the next step if we have such input-output tables. And we're not there. So all of a sudden, there were a number of groups all over the world who were working in constructing these input-output tables. So, for example, there was the group by Manfred Lenzen, I mentioned already. They produced the EORA input-output tables. There was a group in the Netherlands led by Arnold Tucker. They produced the Axiobase data. Well, the first publications were Axiopol, but later it became Axiobase. There was people, individuals, more or less individuals, who were working with the GTAP data. And that was, Glenn Peters was very instrumental there. They were in Trondheim in Norway. And then there was us in the in Groningen, and we produced the Wyan. Also, the OECD at that moment did nothing. No, but they were very, very interested, and they were very instrumental in helping us thinking about this, but they were not doing the OECD input-output tables themselves. Now, afterwards, there have been more, produced more input-output tables, but it turned out, and at a certain stage, we met, these people met with each other, and we met on a French island, Île de la Réunion. Anyone knows where Île de la Réunion is? It's a little bit east of Madagascar. It's approximately where the Maldives are. So it's a wonderful place. The mangoes are on the trees, lovely beaches, coral reefs, etc. So my boss asked me, "Are you sure you want to go there?" Me too. But it turned out the reason why we went there was that it was the shortest distance for all of us, because Manfred Lensen had to come from Australia. There were guys who were coming from Japan. We had to come from Europe. Somebody come from the US. So Manfred, and he organized this. So he had used a computer program, and he found that Ilha, that's in the center. So that's where we met. And there it turned out, because originally we were afraid that we were competing with each other. So at the start of the meeting, we were a little bit reluctant to tell what we're doing, because you might be able, I wanted to steal my ideas or you, and so. But then it turned out that there is so much here, so much information that you ideally want, that the ideal world input-output database or table is huge, with an enormous amount of satellite accounts, an enormous amount of information, which is impossible. And I say this is impossible in the next, at least in the next 20 years. So that stage, there is enough for us, for each of us, to produce an input-output table. So you now also see that these input-output tables, they have a slightly different focus, they have a slightly different perspective, which means that each of these global input-output tables should be used for different purposes. And there is not one table that is one table fits all purposes. So for example, I told you I gave you the example of the black-headed spider monkey. Now, the black-headed spider monkey, that was the story that was published in Nature by Manfred Lensen and his group, was based on calculations with the EOR input-output table. And the EOR input-output table, mentioned already, had 198 countries involved in the table. Well, it's impossible, because not 198 countries have an input-output table. In those days, approximately 60 countries had an input-output table. So it means that they had to estimate the input-output table of approximately 140 input-output countries. So they have estimated much more than anyone else. The advantage of the EOR tables is that they have tiny little countries involved, like the Maldives. If you're talking about threatened species, you're talking about creepy crawlies, you're talking about weird birds, strange snakes, etc., etc. And very often they are on the Maldives. They are in Trinidad and Tobago, not in the Netherlands. I mean, the only animals that we have are cats, dogs, horses. I mean, hardly threatened species. So if you are interested in doing a study on threatened species, you need an input-output table that has these little islands involved where all the creepy crawlies are, because they are threatened. So for a study on threatened species, it's very important to have the information on Trinidad and Tobago, even if the input-output table of Trinidad and Tobago is estimated. That is of lesser importance. So that is EOR. We, in Groningen, we were paid by the European Commission, got a lot of money to make this world input-output database. And we were paid by, let's say, the economists. We had to, or our aim was to build an input-output table, world input-output table for economists. So our focus was on what is important for economists, but economists don't give a shit about agriculture and forestry fitting, I mean, it's such in the Netherlands, in Europe, it's such a small industry. What is important and is what we want to cover is services, because that is where a lot of money is made. So our input-output table, we do have agricultural, and we do have mining, etc. But we do have a lot of things combined. But our services industries, well, we have something like 10 services industries, because that is, for an economist, that is where the action is. Another example is that we wanted, that is the restriction that we set ourselves, we wanted that if you aggregate our input-output tables, the world input-output tables, then you should be able to find exactly the numbers that are in the national accounts. For us, that was important. If you're interested in threatened species, who cares? Oh, yeah, come on. And the problem with national accounts, as some of you may know, they are revised, re-revised, and if you're lucky, revised a second time or third time. Input-output tables are not. They are published only once. So what the first step that we did was take the national input-output tables, even of our own country, and re-estimate them on the basis of the latest information on the national accounts. So our input-output tables, if you take them, they cannot be, they're not the same as the official published input-output tables, but they are matched, they do match the revised national accounts. That was one point. Another issue is that where is the attention? But no, let me rephrase this. So there is, in making these input-output tables, you need to combine national input-output tables. That is what everybody does. Combine national input-output tables with trade data. Now, these two different sources of information cannot be linked to each other. It's impossible. They don't match. There's always huge problems. So the question is, which information is more important for you? So you can say, well, I trust the international trade data much more than I do trust the input-output data. So I take the trade data as a starting point, and I'm going to adapt the national input-output tables to the trade data. That's one thing. That is, for example, what was done in the GTAP database. They said trade is more important than what happens inside the country. We said, well, just have a look. Do run some calculations with your national input-output tables, and you will see that roughly 60, 70, 80, sometimes 90% of the action of what is going on inside your country. So trade is very important, also in input-output analysis. But what happens inside the country is much, much, much more important for employment, for emissions, for whatever. So therefore, we said it's very important that you have good input-output, national input-output tables, and we will adapt the trade data in such a way that they match with the trade data given in the input-output tables. Exio-based database, that is a database that was focusing on environmental aspects, on environmental data. So they have lots of material accounts, they have lots of water, land use, etc. Now I can tell you that in the Wyatt, our own database, if you're interested in water, it's incredibly boring. We have water, but it's almost all in the agricultural sector. So completely uninteresting. So if you're interested in water, like the Exio base, then you should distinguish 10 types of agriculture. You should include several if you're interested in material use. You should not have one mining sector, as we have, but you should have different mining sectors. Now the information in input-output terms doesn't exist. So they had to split a given industry in an input-output table and national input-output tables into, let's say, 10 agricultural sectors. And okay, no doubt it's estimated, so it's incorrect. But what can you do? So all these input-output table ventures that I mentioned, they all had their own strong points. So on the basis of your question that you have, on the basis of what do I want to know, you should select your input-output database. If you're interested into more economics kind of questions, then I suggest our own wire database. If you're interested in water or material use, I suggest, and my own students have used also other databases. So they are using for those questions, they're using the Gaia database, because that is better equipped to answer questions about these issues. Are there any questions? And you can always ask questions in between. I think this is the perfect moment for coffee, if there is coffee. Continue. So now finally get your matrices, matrix out on. I broke the thing. Yeah. So I'm going to show you how the calculations run, and I will do this for a three-world input-output table. So we have the US, we have China, and we have RW. RW stands for the rest of the world. This really is the world. We have here matrices with intermediate deliveries. These are the intermediate deliveries from country 1 to country 2. In this case, from US to China. Here we have the final demands, and let's suppose that's just a single factor from the US. US final products bought by Chinese, for example, households. Here we have values added in a row, and the total production equals the columns, the total production. Because this is the world, there's nothing else. There is no further imports involved, because this is it. We have satellite account in this example with emissions. So these are emissions in, for example, tons. And the rest is in money. So the first thing that we're going to do is calculate the input coefficients. So calculate the 8 matrices. That is basically as we did Monday. Every column here for China, you divide the numbers by the totals. That's how you get your A matrix. So for example, the matrix, the submatrix ARS, for example, the one is in this place, is the intermediate deliveries from country R to country S, and divided a diagonal matrix with a hat, inverse divided by outputs in S. So for example, the first indexes give you always the source. Where does it come from? So this comes from industry I in country R, and the second indices tell you where does it go to. So it goes to industry J in country S. So the input coefficient is the intermediate delivery from to JS divided by the output of the recipient, that is JS. For example, US steel per dollar of AS production, Chinese gold. We do the same with the emission coefficient as we did before. So the emissions in tons or whatever divided by the outputs. Matrix formulation into row vector CR, country R, then a diagonal matrix inverse with outputs, inverse outputs. Then you get for the emission coefficient, emissions in industry IR per dollar of its outputs. So, for example, US steel. Then what do we want? Oh no, this is the input-output model. So we have X equals AX plus F. That is what we did on Monday. Now we have a very long X vector, and we separate vectors per country. We did that here as well. We have the A matrix, which is partitioned into 3x3 blocks, matrices. And actually, this is a single vector with all final demands, but I have distinguished final demands in the US, final demands in China, and in the rest of the world, because I want to have that separate information. Now, if you run the model, then bring A to the other side, and you have I minus A times X equals F, and then invert with I minus A inverse. The I minus A inverse is here M for multiplier matrix. And again, it's partitioned in the same way, 3x3 copies. So this is the solution of the model. Monday, I said, okay, that was even in the example that I told you I gave to high school pupils. Do not change the final demands, but ask how much whatever employment, emissions, or imports are involved in certain exports, for example. Here, now I'm going to, how many US emissions are in China's consumption? That is the question I want to answer. Now, where is the Chinese consumption? And it's here. And observe that Chinese people also consume American products and consume products from the rest of the world. So the full length final demand factor, that represents the bundle, the consumption bundle of China. Now, if you are interested in the production in the US, you're basically interested in the outcome only for the US. So what you do is you calculate this row times that column. So that gives you M11 times F12 plus M12 times F22 plus M13 F32. That gives you the US production that is necessary for just this final demand factor. That is here, the US production necessary for China's consumption bundle. Well, we're talking here about we're talking here about US production. If you're interested how much emissions are in there, multiply them with the US emission coefficients. So this is a relatively short, the size of the US column vector, and this is a row vector. So the outcome, row vector times column vector, is a scalar. So this is a number. The number is 378 or whatever. But it's a number. And this number reflects emissions in country 1 and source necessary for destination 2. That is consumption in destination. That is China. Yeah. In this case, 3 countries, I can do this calculation 9 times at the max. Here are the answers in a table. I have already 1, 2. So the US emissions necessary for Chinese consumption bundle, and we turn down the US exports of emissions to China. Okay. Now, let's add some colors. In red, emissions in China necessary for the US consumption bundle. Emissions in the rest of the world for the US consumption. So these are the US import of emissions, Chinese emissions, and the US import of the rest of the world. The largest part of the US emissions, of course, stays at home. that is emissions in the US that is necessary for its own consumption. Now let us sum up. We have here US emissions necessary for US consumption. US emissions, Chinese consumption, US emissions, rest of the world. If we add them together, then it's the sum of all US emissions. Because there is nowhere else where the emissions can go to. And so the total amount of US emissions, and does it look like yellow from here? Sure. Yeah. Oh, that's yellow enough. Yeah. So that's the total amount of US emissions, of course, in the production. And we also have these emissions directly by households driving a car. And if we take these two together, US emissions in production processes plus the US emissions by households, we have all territorial emissions. Now, look at the consumption bundle of the US. So then we have US emissions for US households, with Chinese US households, we have rest of the world emissions for US households. So there is no other country involved. So we have all the emissions globally of the bodies US. So altogether, that is so it is that is the US consumption. It began as emissions directly to households, that is the definition of the carbon footprint. So, relatively easy, maybe it's not rocket science. If you look back the slides next week or so, it's easy peasy. Now, observe. Yellow is green plus blue. So yellow minus blue is green. Green plus red is purple. So yellow minus blue is green. Plus red is purple. That is the connection between yellow and purple. Yellow minus blue is green, plus red is purple. That is the connection between the territorial emissions and the carbon footprint of the US. Wait a minute. This is something you saw before. One of the, not first, but very first part, showed you this. Emissions in the US for a resident, the emissions in the production process, minus the exports of emissions, plus the US imports of emissions, gives you the footprint. Now, that is exactly what it says here. And this is blah, blah, I'm wording. Here you can actually yourself can do the calculation. Some more fun about trade balances. So you see the trade balance is by definition US exports minus imports. So blue minus red gives you the emissions trade balance of, in this case, the US. But you see that blue minus red is the same as yellow minus purple. So the difference between the territorial emissions and the footprint gives you the trade balance of this case, the US. Okay, next I'm going to look at some results. This example, this case, also discussed last Monday, but now I'm going to give you some more detailed information. So again, not again, we are looking here at greenhouse gas emissions. So that will be CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. And the reason to look at greenhouse gas emissions is that these are the emissions that are important for global warming. And we have transform them into CO2 equivalents on the basis of what is the global warming potential, GWP, global warming potential. That gives you transformation factors to transform tons of methane into the same tons. So here we have, last Monday, I combined these into rich countries and all these into poor countries. Here are these are the territorial emissions. And you see the global emissions increased by 1/3 between 95 and 2008. We have chosen 2008. The data are also available for 2009, at least at this stage. But the data look like this due to the financial crisis. So 2008 then was the world at its top at that stage. That's why we stopped there. So an enormous increase of 9 gigatons, 30% between 95 and 2008. Also see that the rich countries managed to have their territorial emissions stable, and you see that the not so rich countries increase their territorial emissions, and in particular an enormous increase of emissions in China. And of course, yes, in China, the wealth was increasing. China was doing economically better. So they started adopting more or less Western lifestyle. More people started driving a car. Finally, also Chinese families could buy air conditioning, which was impossible before. So of course, sure, the emissions went up. To a lesser extent, also in India, Brazil. The rest of the world is just the rest of the world taken together. We should be very careful because the rest of the world also includes Canada, not a very poor country, includes Australia, also not extremely poor, but the large part of the countries in all the other countries are also African countries for which we do not have separate information, but a lot of developing countries are in there. Russia did not increase its emissions very much. Not much happened there, but Russia is largely dependent on our resources. So the territorial emissions, this is a period of growth and the difference between rich and not so rich countries. These are the greenhouse gas footprints. And you've seen already the summary last Monday. Well, you see that the footprints of the EU, they are larger than the territorial emissions. For the US, it is also, it was a slide before, I think. Difference between territorial and footprints is that here you see that the footprint in Europe is clearly larger than the territorial emissions. So it means that European consumers are responsible, could be held responsible for much more emissions than they actually generate themselves. So the Europe is a net importer and a serious net importer of emissions. So is US, and to a lesser extent also Japan. And we also see here that all the poor countries are net exporters, but the largest net exporter is China. So the angry young guy was very right. China is exporting a lot of emissions. We see that the net export of emissions by the BRIC countries is 2.8 gigatons. The Europe, US, and Japan are net importers of 3 gigatons, and observe that 26% of the Chinese emissions, a quarter of the Chinese emissions of the territorial emissions is export. So there is a whole lot of trade in emissions. That was the guy, he was right. Now have a look at this column. Let's focus on this column. See, the column remains the same. This is territorial footprint territorial emissions minus the footprint. And this is export minus imports. And that was what I said previous slide. Yellow minus blue, I think, was something like that. Was footprint minus territorial minus footprint. Observe. So on this slide, we had footprint and the territorial emissions. So these are net imports. It doesn't mean that Europe does not export emissions. So Europe exports emissions, but imports 1.6 gigaton more emissions. Observe that the total amount of exports, which is of course in the whole world equal to the total amount of imports, is 10.4. And in 2008, we were talking about approximately 40 gigatons of emissions. So it means that approximately 1/4, 25% of the emissions globally are consumed in another country than where they are emitted. So 20% of all the emissions is traded globally. So a lot of trade is going over the world. Well, these are the numbers about net exports and imports, and this will be already saw. This is now the combined story. Some more colors. This graph, this table you have seen if you were there on Monday. So if we look at the development over time of the rich countries, then they were stabilizing, more or less stabilizing their territorial emissions. They said, well, look us, we are the champions of the Kyoto Protocol. We did very well, didn't we? No, not at all. You were cheating because your footprints increased. Still increased your footprint. The poor countries also increased their footprint by 7.3, but they increased their territorial emissions more, even more, by 8.6. So it means that the net export of poor, rich, used to be 1.6 and now are 3.0. So the gap between poor and rich was already substantial, but has become large. So you could say, if you like, that the rich is exploiting the poor even more than before. Because the gap increased from 1.6 to 3. So the conclusion of these greenhouse gas results is that the poor emit for the rich. The rich call themselves the kings of the Kyoto Protocol, but their footprints increase. And as a consequence, the gap between rich and poor did increase. The poor increase their footprints, of course, They were catching up. China got richer, did Brazil as did India, but territorial emissions increased even more. Okay. So far about global emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. The next step is basically doing the same thing, but then for value added. So, all familiar with outsourcing, offshoring, nearshoring, reshoring, reshoring, and whatever. I mean, it sounds like economists are lying on the beach all the time. International fragmentation, slicing up the value chain, etc. So the point is that these production processes are sliced up into ever smaller parts, and some parts are outsourced to subcontractors in foreign countries. We have talked already about first, and in particular, the second wave of global unbundling, and this led to an upsurge of trade in intermediate products. That is what we have already discussed. Today's products and services are no longer produced within a single country. They're made in global value chains. So it's a team effort. And this slide, not the Pumas anymore, like they were on Monday. This is again the airplane. It says here final assembly, Boeing, US, and it tells you some of the intermediate inputs. So we recognize this as a US airplane. So it's recognized as an American airplane. It's a Boeing. So this is if a Boeing is exported, recognized as US exports. So what you get then is, hey, Ernie, is that an American airplane? No, but it's a team effort flying in the sky. That's actually what it is, but nobody recognizes that as a team effort flying in the sky. But that is what we do. It's a team effort, but by saying, well, it's an American airplane, and these are American exports, you're basically giving a gold medal or only to the goal scorer of the team, and forget about the rest of the team. So that is not unfair. So therefore, what would be the alternative? This is what you do when you focus only on the exports of final goods. What's the alternative? Adding up all imported intermediates to the value of the exports. Well, if you do that, it leads to serious double count. I mean, in principle, these gross exports don't say don't say that much anymore. I mean, we could play the game that I send you an email tonight with a silly idea, and you pay me $1 million for that. You respond to me by adding a single letter or so, or a number, and you ask me $1 million for that. Then I add another figure and send it back to you. So in principle, if there were no import taxes, we could go back and forth by adding almost nothing and charging each other $1 million every time. It means that the gross exports and imports as well would go up tremendously, and basically nothing happened. Very little. So that is a very silly example, but it indicates that we should be careful with looking at gross exports only. So there, it doesn't tell the whole story anymore. In the past, it did. In the past, it was only a final product that goes from here to there. So basically, then you have the value added created in one country, the exporting country, is exported to the importing country. And that's all. So in that case, the export of the final product, they tell almost the whole story, but not if things are going back and forth. That is the problem. So because products and services are no longer produced within a single country, They are made in global value chains. The gross imports and exports do no longer adequately affect what is going on. And this led around 2012, led the World Trade Organization and OECD to start their Made in the World initiative. And so this said, next to standard trade figures, we also need trade in value-added figures. And that was the starting point of what now is the TIVA database by the OECD and the OECD's ICIO tables. They are, let's say, behind the TIVA calculations and also available. So these trade in value added, or what I call trade in value added, partly that reflects how much Chinese value added ends up on a US consumption plate. Or consumption is to be interpreted as investment, including investment, government expenditures, and household consumption. Now here we have some results. Here we have the trade balance of the US with several other countries. So the US has a huge deficit with China, with Germany, and also a deficit of 19 or almost $90 billion. $20 billion with Mexico. If, however, you look at the trade in value added, so the value added exports, net exports, then the deficit with China is only 190. Germany and Mexico, the deficit reduces to just $28 billion. So in total, instead of a deficit of $480 billion, it's now $80 billion in terms of value added, in terms of GDP. Now, in those days, there were many calls that US should devaluate its currency, and which is seemed reasonably fair on the basis of $480 billion. If that is a shortage, yeah, you could say, yeah, it's fair. But the question is that also still fair, or if the shortage, if the deficit is just $80 billion? I'm not answering that question because that is not important. The importance here is, are you talking about this figure or that figure? That is what matters. So, in the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk about actually the question, who works how much for whom? And working means earning money, earning GDP, or contributing to the value added. Here are the results. I'm going to take you slowly through these results. So this is for 2008. Numbers are in $billion, US dollars. And it gives the export and import of value added. That's part of the GDP. And the percentages indicate as a percentage of GDP. So, for example, the export of value added is part of the American GDP. Imports of value added, it's foreign value added, is not a percentage, it's not part of GDP. So it reflects only that this is measured as a share of that, or not a share, as a ratio, basically to benchmark. So what we see is that the USA exports $1,268 billion of its GDP. So, for example, this includes the value added created in US plastics, in plastic goods or just plastic, that goes to US manufacturing, that goes across to Canadian retail, and that finally ends up in the products, the Canadian products bought by French consumers. So observe that here in this simple example, there is absolutely no exports, literally exports from the US to France. So it is just the value added generated in the US plastics industry that somehow along the way gets embodied in products from Canadian retail that end up on the French consumer plate. That is this chain, very short chain, that is included in the 1268. And that also is included in the imports of foreign value added by French consumption. A small part is the value added earned by US plastics. That is what is in the numbers. Yellow are the major players. So here is the column with GDP, and these are simply the largest, the countries with the largest GDP. And in this case, I think the cutoff is 3,000. That is US 14, Germany 3, Japan almost 5, China 4.5, and the rest of the world 8,000. Here we have the major traders. And it's not surprising that the large countries are also the large traders. I mean, a country like the Netherlands, it's impossible that they are a large trader. Not surprising. Here are the largest traders in terms of percentage. And now you do see that some small countries pop up as large traders or major traders. So, for example, the export of value added by Canada are very limited, but they amount to 26% of GDP. Of course, there's an intimate connection with the US, and the imports largely from the US is 24. You see also that Russia, dependent largely on resources, the export of GDP is pretty large, 26%. And of course, that might be somehow counterbalanced, so also the imports are considerable. Relatively small countries like Korea are major traders, and Taiwan. And there's a long list of countries, and if you would include very small countries like the Netherlands and Denmark, for example, Belgium, Luxembourg, and they will also have very large numbers here. The small traders, well, the large traders are trading a lot, but in terms of percentages, they are not very large. So Japan, US, we already saw on Monday, that these are very self-supporting, independent countries. That was also the story of Brazil, a huge country that does not need to trade at all. They have everything within the country. See that reflected here. The averages are interesting. So the average is 20% export import, and the unweighted average is 28-29%. The weights are the sizes of the exports and imports of value added for the country. So what it says here is that if you take the unweighted average, small countries are just as important as large countries. Observe, recall that small countries, Korea, Taiwan, and small European countries, have large percentages. So if the small countries have a large percentage of exports of value added, are weighted equally as the large countries, which have small percentages, then of course the unweighted average is much larger than the weighted average. That's what it says here. The weights are export of value added, and in this column, import of value. Reason why the weighted average is small 20 is smaller than the unweighted average 28 is that countries with little export of value added, they are often the smaller countries. They receive the same weight, equally important as states with much export of value, larger countries. Well, these are the major countries involved in net trade. Observe also the position of Germany. Germany was a large country, a large trader, but also Germany was the exception to the rule. It exported a lot of its value added, of its GDP. And this was a political decision by Germany to focus on exports, and that worked well. So here is last table about these results. Observe here this number. It's exactly this number. And the 1268 is here. So subtracting the 1268 from the 14,000 something gives me the 13,000. So if this is total GDP, and this is the exports of GDP, then this must be the part of the GDP that is for the American consumers themselves. Now, if this is American GDP for American consumers, then if I add the imports, then I have something, well, you could call that is the value-added footprint of the US consumers. So the consumers, US consumers, they eat so much American GDP and so much foreign GDP. This was the GDP in green, and here we have what we could call the value-added footprint of American consumption. No, there's one more table. Here you see that 91% of US GDP is for US consumers at home. Now I can tell you that that is a very large number because the US is the most self-supporting country. So for most countries, this percentage will be much lower. And in particular, countries like the Netherlands, are very, very dependent on other countries. It will be around 67%. And here is these results. Here, US at the bottom. So these numbers are all in the previous tables. You have seen the numbers themselves. But now I have these numbers were in previous tables, and this is 100 minus 36. This is the percentage, not that is exported, but that stays at home. And 91% of US GDP stays at home, and for a relatively small country like Taiwan, only 64% of its GDP stays at home. On average, it's 20% is consumed in another country, 80% stays at home. And this again confirms what I said before, that if you have any question about your economy, what happens at home is much more of influence. It's much more important than what happens abroad. So it is very important look at trade in value added, it's 20%. I mean, it's not nothing, but if in your calculations, in your analyses, first check what happens at home, because that is that is larger in terms of size. I suggest that we have a short break in 10 minutes or so, and then we continue with the last applications.
Okay. Sí, no hay nada, o sea, pero hay que darlo actualizado todo, ya no la verán. Sí, porque no acontece. Sí.
Your paper is in Gaster?
Sorry?
Your paper is in Gaster?
I think that depends, but very often JSTOR is a little bit later.
Yes.
Maybe not the most recent years.
But maybe it is in the page of the library of the university, no?
Yes.
Maybe in the.
But if you cannot find it, or if you do not have access to it, send me an email message. I have downloaded the electronic version and I can send it. Not sure whether it's legal, but I don't care. This holds for any of my papers. I mean, if ever you are looking for one reason or another, for a paper that I wrote or where I contributed as author, and you cannot download it, cannot find it, send me an email message. I have most of them electronically available.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
We'll continue. I mean, the others, we can drop in, they will drop in or not. This paper that I wrote together with Timon Bowen and Steven Brockman. Timon Bowen was our PhD student, and Stephen and I were his supervisor. It was published in the Journal of International Economics, and as I mentioned in the break to those who were here, if ever you need paper that where I contributed as co-author, and you cannot find it, you don't have it in your library or whatever, it's not in JSTOR or whatever, send me a message and I can send you an electronic version of the paper. I have most of what I have published, I have electronically available. So if it happens that I don't have it, I will tell you. So this is a story that is, the title is From Exports to Value Added to Income. So we saw that we started with gross exports in the past. At a certain stage, it doesn't tell the whole story anymore. Then we looked at the exports of value added. Monday, I told you also, gave you the example about China and Chinese upgrading, where the Chinese government said you must do better in earning more GDP on your exports. That is what China did, but they financed it with foreign direct investments, and as a consequence, the Chinese, out of their GDP, the increased GDP, they had a lot to pay back in terms of money going abroad. So here, the point is that the value added GDP that is, or the part of GDP that is generated within a country does not necessarily stay in that country, and means that it's also income for that country. And this is more so now than it used to be the case, because the importance of multinational firms has increased a lot. Nowadays, approximately 80% of GDP trade, global value chain trade, is coordinated by multinational companies. So therefore, a lot of GDP that is created in one country, the profits go back to the multinational that resides somewhere else. So we have seen a rise in global value chains, the production of goods that involves at least two countries, and often a multitude of stages that may consist of capital and labor inputs from dozens of countries. That is what we've seen in global value chains. And the question is, how much of that remains within the country as income? So the two typical examples are labor and capital. So we're talking here in this paper, for example, about cross-border workers. Is people, for example, Canadian residents who live on one side of the border work in the US. In that case, a Canadian resident working in the US, it's part of the US GDP, but because it's a Canadian resident, it's part of the Canadian GNI. So that is included, but also the profits that are made in one country and the profits that are by means of dividends are paid to another country, that is also transfer of income. So what are we talking about when we're talking about exports, when we're talking about exports of value added, and now about income? So consider the consumption in Germany of final products, one or final. And suppose that the German consumers, government, consumes French, Italian, and German final products. So this is the location of the production of final products. Now, the French final products use inputs from UK and own inputs. The Italian final product basically uses labor and capital. It does not need any other inputs. Okay, that's possible. The German final product has inputs from Germany and inputs from Poland. So this level indicates the production of intermediates. This level is labor and capital. UK intermediates, French value added producing these final products, Italy, Germany producing intermediates and the final products, and some Polish value added. Now, of course, this value added leads to national income, GNI, but UK, for example, UK capital is financed from the US. So in that case, the dividends go to the US. Poland, this Polish product is made in Poland with labor and capital, but some of these workers come from Slovakia. It's a neighboring country to Poland. So we have here income transfers for labor, and here, for example, for capital. So the red lines indicate the gross exports, really products crossing the border. So where you can see, okay, across the border. In green, that is what we've had so far. That is straight in value added. So the exports were not for Germany, that's not an export, but the UK, the French, the Italian, and the Polish part of GDP that is consumed in Germany. And now the blue part, that is GNI in US, UK, France, Italy, Poland, Slovakia, that is embodied in the German consumption bundle. So that will be, except for Germany, that will be the exports of GNI to Germany. And the upper part is already, that was known already. And in this paper, the blue part, that is what is added by us. What is it? So the central question is, how much income in terms of its GNI does, for example, Mexico generate from US consumption of final products? So how much of Mexican GNI is in the US consumption bundle? And this is no matter where the final products are made. So it may be the case that your GNI is embodied in the products that I make in the Netherlands and export to the US. It may even be the case that you hate the US so much that you do not wish to trade with the US, but still then, because you do love me, and your GNI is in my products, and I do trade. And this, all this is called the income exports, like the value-added exports from Mexico, in this case, to the US. And this is the natural extension of value-added exports. And that was the key question in a paper by Johnson and Aguirre, also in the Journal of International Economics in 2012. And that question was, how much value added in terms of GDP does Mexico generate from US consumption of final product? So the same question, but here only value added, and here one step further, GNI. Our strategy is that we will construct a GDP GNI matrix. How do you transfer GDP into GNI? Using bilateral transfers of income. And we combine this with information that is already known from the input-output tables, namely value-added exports. And that gives us a DNIC matrix, as we call it, containing the bilateral export of income. We'll see that later. So here we have a table with GDP, GNI matrix. So your GDP that is created in your country, example in country 1, part of the GDP stays at home. Part of the GDP goes to country I. So for example, income transfers for workers from I working in country 1. This is part of the dividends that you make in your country 1 and that are paid that go to country J. So income transfer going to J and etc. All this is together is GDP. And this tells you the distribution of where your GDP goes to, where does your earnings go to. This stays at home, and this in terms of income transfer go abroad. How do you get your income? Well, part of your own GDP that stayed at home, plus the income transfers that you get from abroad. So that could be your people working abroad, for example, or you having done some investments in country J, and these are the dividends. These are incoming income transfers. The IT stands for income transfer from country I to country J, and VAI, sorry, is the income that stays at home in country. And this gives you also immediately the link between GDP and GNI. Gross national income is gross domestic product minus the primary incomes that you pay, plus the primary incomes that you receive. And the primary incomes that you pay are outgoing income transfers, and what you receive are the yellow transfers. The key assumption that we make is that whatever GDP, whatever you earn in terms of GDP, is equally distributed according to these ratios. So, for example, if 90% stays at home, then it doesn't matter what value added you have, 90% stays at home. If 5% goes to country J, then you keep the 5% as a share. And that is, you do this whatever value added you're talking about. This is in these shares. Now we know that final demand in country J, this is in the graph, for example, the German consumption, generates GDP in country I. Now that is the value added export from country I, GDP from country I, that is in the consumption bundle of country J. Now, if this is now GDP in country I, how much remains in the country? Well, 90%, that's what I said. And 5% goes to country, whatever it was. So I'm going to use these shares to tell you how much goes of this GDP that you earned in country I, how much goes to income in country K. Because that is here. What goes to country K? K, well, this is J, K is here. This year I'm going to use also for this this part of it. So country K's GNI, due to the final demands in J, that is so much. In K, final demands in J, well, and the addition here is this goes through country I, the GDP of country I. Well, I don't care if I'm interested in the income in country K. I don't care whether it goes through country I, or 1, or 2, or N, or J, or whatever. So therefore, I take the summation. And this is now GNX. So this is export of GNI from country K to country J. This gives you the amount gives you the amount of GNI in country K that is embodied in the final demands of country J. This is the math you use matrix algebra. So in that case, I can now make a table. So in the columns, you give the final demands. So the final demands, the final consumption bundle of Germany, okay? There's so much GNI from the US, so much from the Netherlands, so much from Germany itself, et cetera, et cetera. And if you take the summation, you can prove that this is total amount of final demands in country J, in Germany. And if you do row-wise, you have the GNI that is in the consumption profile of country 1, of country 2, et cetera, et cetera. Well, there are only a limited number of consumption profiles where it can go to, so the total is GNI of the country. So for example, this is the GNI, national income, part of national income in Mexico that is in the consumption bundle of US consumers. Now, here are the results. This is the percentage of value-added exports, the percentage of GDP. And this is the percentage of gross national income that is exported as a percentage of GNI. And observe, first of all, and prove that that is always the case, that the second row, the ratio for national income is always larger than the ratio for value added for GDP. Observe also that this ratio between these two is the largest for the US. So what does this ratio tell you? It tells you the difference between GNI as a percentage, the GNI exports as a percentage of GNI, and the value-added exports as a percentage of GDP. Now, in the US, this is the large one. Now, what is the case in the US? Well, the US is a very self-supporting country, and they owe a lot of capital abroad. So they do not self-supporting, so the numbers, the percentages are relatively little. The US does not export very much of its GDP, but it does export much more of GNI because it's the owner of a lot of capital abroad. In contrast, you see that the number is very small for Brazil and or this ratio for Brazil and for Mexico. The percentage here for Brazil is relatively small. For Mexico, it's much larger. Brazil was a very self-supporting country. So these percentages, it doesn't export too much. Mexico has a long-standing trade relationship with the US. So the exports and also the value-added export and the GNI exports are much larger in Mexico than they are in Brazil. Why are these numbers so low? Well, the low-income countries, they pay lots of transfers. So the value-added exports that is almost goes entirely to no, it doesn't go entirely to the US, but it also they don't get very much income transfers, but they do pay a lot of income transfers. So therefore, the ratio is approximately 1. Observe that the Latin Netherlands has a tremendous percentage. I told you already, we produce nothing. Because the country is so small, we're dependent on other countries, and therefore we also export a lot of our value added and GNI. But we are a relatively rich country, and we also own quite a bit of capital abroad. And therefore, this ratio is closer to the US than etc. This is pretty shocking, because the trade deficit of the US, we've seen that it was sizable. And in terms of gross trade, the trade balance is 2.8% of GDP. If you consider trade and value added as percentage of GDP, it's still 2.5%, still considerable. But trade and GNI is only 0.2%. So the complete trade deficit of the US almost completely vanishes if you look at GNI. And the reason is that the US owns a lot of capital abroad, so it receives a lot of income transfers in terms of dividends. So that is the value-added perspective and GNI. Like I said, the US owns much capital abroad and most capital at home. So the value-added exports of the US, because it owns its own capital, that is more or less the same as GNI export. But the imports of the US, the value-added imports, are much larger than the GNI imports. So the import of the US of value-added from Mexico, for example, is much larger than the import of Mexican GNI, because part of the Mexican GNI goes back to the US in terms of dividends. That is why this is clearly larger. So if you then look at the deficit of the US and compare this in terms of value added and GNI, then the imports here in GNI terms, they are much smaller, they go down. So therefore the deficit goes down. And that is what we saw. Instead of 2%, 2.5%, it's now all of a sudden just 0.2%. This is typical for also for other high countries, high income countries, not as strong as it is for the US. And the opposite holds for the emerging and developing countries. For emerging and developing countries, well, whatever they import in terms of value added is more or less the same as what they import from, for example, from the US. However, the value added exports of Mexico is smaller than its GNI exports to the US, because the GNI export to the US from Mexico includes also these income transfers. So if you look at the deficit or surplus for Mexico, that goes up. This is how this works. Here is some graphs you cannot see. This is Brazil, Canada, China, India, Ireland, Japan, Mexico, and the UK. We have in red bar left the gross trade balance with the US, the tax trade balance with the US. This green bar is the income transfers, and the purple bar, most to the right, is the income trade balance. What we see here for Mexico, we had a gross trade balance of 89 billion US dollars. It's the intermediate products that are traded with Mexico. They're made largely with cheap labor. So the earnings, the Mexican earnings are not so much. So the value-added exports of Mexico is much less, only 58 billion dollars. But because a lot of the factories are owned by US firms, there is a substantial surplus of income transfers from Mexico to the US, and therefore G&I trade of US with Mexico is, from the US perspective, a deficit of only $40 billion. The surplus of Mexico is therefore also $40 billion. So that is what the story is about. It adds the next step to the exports. This is who is afraid of Virginia Woolf? And this is about US employment footprints and self-sufficiency. And also it's again with the same authors. And this is the picture that is made. Who is afraid of Virginia Woolf? And that was a famous play, and they also made a movie out of this play. And you may recognize Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. It's a famous movie, and the reason to write this paper was because we got crazy of all these tweets by Donald Trump. And basically the message of the tweets was, the Chinese are stealing our jobs. And also in Europe, we heard some politicians claim that also European jobs were stolen by Chinese. And possibly here in Mexico, you have heard similar stories that you, in Mexico, are stealing jobs from Americans or whatever. I guess. So Virginia Woolf is a play about an illusion. Illusion is Virginia Woolf. And so, because we think stealing jobs is an illusion, and that is their Virginia Woolf, and therefore we said, okay, let's instead of Virginia Woolf, let us call her Virginia Woolf. So we're using employment footprints. And the question is, again, with the footprint question, how much labor is embodied in the bundle of final products consumed by, in this case, US. US consumers, how much labor do you eat? So we did a calculation, and we found that in the final consumption bundle of the US, there were 141 million workers, US workers involved. 11 million US workers work on products or whatever. Their work is embodied in the consumption bundle of another country. So that will be the exports of US workers. There are 9 million unemployed workers in the US. So the total labor force in the US is is 161. Imports of workers, foreign workers. So the amount of workers, foreign workers, that is embodied in the US consumption bundle is 123 million workers. So that is a whole lot. But we don't believe that numbers, because US is a very efficient producer. So very often they produce whatever they produce with less workers and much more machinery than anywhere else in the world. So we did a calculation, and it turned out that US workers are on average 7.4 times as productive as foreign workers. So if you take that correction into account, it means that whatever 7 workers abroad can manage, can be achieved in China and in the US by a single worker. So if you are talking about 120 million workers, foreign workers, then if you're saying they are stealing 123 million US workers, that is not fair. So you should take into account, in that case, that these 123 million foreign workers are comparable to just 17 million US workers. That is the fair comparison. And in that case, you see that the footprint, the total amount of workers that is involved in the US consumption bundle is 158. So these results are in what we call US efficient worker. They have been transformed. Now, if you take a look at these numbers, then you see that the export of US workers is 11, imports of US efficient workers is 17, so the net imports are 6. Unemployed workers are 9. So if 6 million workers out of these 9 million accept a job, then America can sustain their own consumption bundle just by themselves. They don't need the rest of the world anymore. But usually, as economists, we say that there is a natural friction unemployment of 5%. So the natural unemployment, if that is 5%, if we accept that, then that translates into 8 million workers. Then there's 1 million workers left out of 9 million, not out of 9 million unemployed. So that means a deficit of 5 million workers, which means that the US that year did not have enough workers basically to support themselves. So whatever Donald Trump said, and we already know that Donald Trump was, well, in some aspects, not the smartest guy in the world. Perhaps in some other aspects he was, but certainly not in this aspect. So that he was telling nonsense. The US would never ever be able in this year to support its own consumption pattern. So you can translate this in percentages. By itself, only by itself, it can produce only 97% of its own consumption. So the US really needed foreign workers embodied in its bundle, whether it's Chinese or Mexican, whatever is here. We have the numbers there. This is here not important. But the US is not able to be self-sufficient in this respect. And of course, the people who accept the job, well, that could be a requirement is there that that professors accept the job if they are accepted a job in a factory. And it is also if factory workers accept a job as professor, which of course they happily do, but it's not a question. Okay, these results were just there to indicate what it was, and we had these detailed results, detailed information only for 2008. So, all in all, what have we done today? Where did we come from? What is the change between 98 and 2020? We talked about Kyoto Protocol and the international fragmentation. I said these were, in my view, the turning points in the recent history. We made a distinction between production-based emission accounting and consumption-based emission accounting. This was the footprint type of accounting. all global emissions embodied in the final use somewhere else, for example. And here we have the export of domestic and, well, the production-based emission accounting, only what happens inside, and that includes the exports of domestic consumption emissions, but excludes the imports of foreign emissions. So the difference between the two was trade in emissions. Then we looked at the central question, who emits how much for whom? And we talked about slicing up the production process, fragmentation, etc., global value chain, football teams, veterinary, whatever. We talked about double counting, we talked about the incorrect signals, and we talked about the OECD World Trade Organization initiative that led to the TVA database made in the world, value-added database. So that gave us answers to the question, who works in terms of GDP, value-added, how much for whom? So and that has changed because these two questions, as we've seen in the applications, can now be answered because we have the availability of world input-output tables. And with these world input-output tables, we can take account of global value chains. And I think that has changed in the last 25 years. I think this is my last slide. Oh, wow. Did you see that? That was my last slide. Thank you. The lecture on Friday will be, I guess, a bit more technical. I'm going to talk about a very specific thing, structural decomposition analysis, which is a tool to look into the growth or the change in one variable, for example, emission growth, and how much of emission growth is due to changes in technology, changes in consumption, etc., etc. And it's pretty technical. So I think that at least 1.5 hours will be more technical stuff.
Excellent.
you.